Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Pink from my home office in Washington, D.C. I'm here today with the great privilege of interviewing Rutger Bregman, the author of this terrific, very provocative, extraordinarily interesting book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. So we're going to talk about some of his very big and provocative ideas. So Rutger, so as you know, I love the book. For the people who have not had the good fortune of having read the book yet, give us there's a big idea in this book. Tell us what that big idea is.
Well, the really short summary would be something like, most people are pretty decent. That's it. You know?
Right. But why is that a big idea?
Yeah, it's a revolutionary idea. It's a dangerous idea. It's an incredibly subversive idea. Because if we can actually trust each other, if most people deep down are not angels, but at least pretty decent, then we can organize our society in a totally different way. Nowadays, we've based so many of our institutions, we've built them on the notion that people are just selfish and that we can't trust each other, that civilization is only a thin veneer, and that when something happens, like a crisis, like a pandemic, that we quickly turn into savages. If that's not the case, then we can move to a much more egalitarian, democratic society with very different kind of organizations, very different kind of schools. So people may think, oh, this is a book about human kindness, how innocent, but it's actually quite subversive.
Well, it's subversive in the sense that it's a book about human nature. Let's forget about sort of putting a valence on it, on kindness or not. And I think what's subversive about it is that you are you're challenging a core premise of how modern society is organized, that our system of laws, many of our systems of policies are built on the idea that people are selfish, mean, willing to take immoral, willing to take shortcuts, and need to be controlled. Now, let's expand on this a little bit, because this is an idea, or these two competing ideas have a deep tradition in philosophy as embodied by two figures. Why don't you tell us that? Because I think it really gives the book a kind of a grounding in intellectual history.
Sure, yeah. So in the 17th century, you had this philosopher called Thomas Hobbes, one of the most important political philosophers, who ever existed. He wrote a book called Leviathan, in which he made the argument that in the past, very long time ago, when we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, we lived lives that were, in his words, nasty, brutish, and short. And that there was some kind of war of all against all going on. Now, he made the case that we had the ability to overcome this by appointing a Leviathan, someone in power, someone who's basically keeping all of us in check. So the book is, I think, in many ways an argument for hierarchy. Often a cynical view of human nature is an argument for hierarchy, because then people need to be kept in control. Now, he's often placed in opposition with the French philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They never met. It was like he was born like a century later. But Rousseau made the exact opposite argument. He said, no, actually, nomadic hunter-gatherers, they live pretty good lives, and it is civilization that is this big disaster. Civilization has poisoned everything. We should never have settled down. We should never have invented private property. That's when we got hierarchy, patriarchy, wars, you name it. And so the history of Western philosophy is in many ways dominated by this big opposition between Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes always being described as the realist, and Rousseau as the romantic, revolutionary, sentimental Frenchman.
And in many ways, Hobbes has prevailed.
Yes.
Or if it's a boxing match, Hobbes is winning on points into the later rounds. Because I do think that even that phrase that he used, nasty, brutish, and short, which sounds like a law firm, but nasty. Even that phrase is one that has really stuck. And I guess what this tells us is, to me, it's basically about. You said at the very beginning, you put forth this idea called veneer theory, and so it's really a question of what do we believe about civilization? Is civilization keeping us from becoming inhuman, or is civilization preventing us from becoming human?
Yes, exactly.
And you're on the side that you're a Rousseauian more than obviously much more.
A bit more Rousseauian than Hobbesian, or Hobbesian, how do you pronounce it? I'm not going all the way with Rousseau, but it's really interesting that if you look at the latest evidence from archaeology and anthropology, you realize that in many ways he was the real realist. Indeed, we've got a huge amount of evidence now that nomadic hunter-gatherers lived lives that were, quite relaxed, relatively short working week, quite egalitarian, no evidence for war. But then when we settled down, and we invented agriculture, that was in many ways a big disaster. Our health deteriorated. We got all these infection diseases. We started engaging in wars. We have, I think, forgot about that a little bit because we've seen so much progress since the Industrial Revolution, and especially in the last couple of decades. So I'm not saying that people have to go back and live as hunter-gatherers again, but I am saying that it's important to have a realistic view of our history.
Well, and I think that's what's interesting about it is that I think that superficially some of your ideas might sound like idealistic, but what you're doing is but you have, and for the folks who haven't read this set, the sweep here is really quite extraordinary. There is, not only do we talk about Hobbes and Rousseau, we talk, there's a lot of research from the fields of psychology and social psychology. There is a very, throughout the entire book, a very strong case from evolutionary biology here. So the sweep here, I think what you're saying is that view, the more Rousseauian view, is actually closer to the truth. Now, on that point, so the story that I've been dining out on one of your stories, and the one that I just told my kids the other day over dinner had to do with this book that American middle school students always read, Lord of the Flies. You put a bunch of boys on an island, and of course, horrible things start happening. And for middle school English students, it's this kind of introduction to literature where you say, where it's like, oh, this is not only a story, but there's a theme, kids. There's a theme in this story, and the theme is that humans are brutal and vicious. Now, you did some fascinating digging to say that there's actually, back to your point about reality, there's actually a real life story of boys on an island. Tell us about that, because I think it's just gripping and fascinating.
Well, when I was 16 or 17 years old, I read it as well, Lord of the Flies. And for me, it felt like a bit of a coming of age experience, right? You think, well, probably this is what kids are really like. No more little princes on prairies for me. Now I've got a realistic view. It was only years later, while researching this book, that I wondered, has it ever really happened? We've been telling millions of school kids since the 1950s this story, but maybe we should check out whether there's ever been a case in all world history where real kids shipwrecked on a real island. And so, after a couple of months of research, I managed to track down the real Lord of the Flies. So this happened in 1965 in Tonga, which is an island group in the Pacific Ocean. And there were 6 boys with an Anglican boarding school. They were fed up with school, basically. They hated it. They hated the school meals. They were bored. They wanted to go on an adventure. And so they did. They borrowed a boat. They ended up in a storm already on the first night. They drifted for 8 days, shipwrecked on this uninhabited island, and survived for 50 months. And turns out that,
it was 50? 15?
15, yeah.
15. So yeah, 1-5. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, okay.
My problem was a Dutchman. I can never.
No. I was thinking I read it wrong. It's like, wow, 4 years. That's pretty impressive. I thought it was shorter than that.
To be honest, I think they could have gone on for 4 years.
Well, go ahead. You tell the rest of the story.
Because they were rescued. They were rescued by an Australian captain named Peter Warner. But rescue is not really the right word, because they had established a small, like a mini civilization. They had built their own gym with very curious weights. They had a badminton court. They worked in teams of two to tend to the garden, to cook, to be on the lookout for other ships. And I managed to track one of them down. His name is Mano. And he's still the best of friends with Peter, the captain who rescued them. And it gets even better, because I recently published the story in The Guardian. It went viral, and now there's going to be a big Hollywood movie about it. I didn't realize that. The producers of 12 Years a Slave have bought the rights. And it's been really extraordinary, because I was on this Zoom call with the 4 survivors who were on this island in 1965, with the captain, and we discussed together what the best Hollywood studio would be to go with. It was really extraordinary. It's been the highlight of my career so far.
Wow, that's amazing. That's great. So that's some breaking news. So it turned out that when you put boys on an island in real life, or at least there's one instance that we have of that, they do the opposite of what happened in Lord of the Flies.
Yeah. And
they
I realize it's just an anecdote, right? It's just an anecdote. It's not science. But I mean, Lord of the Flies is fiction, and we still have been telling it to millions of people around the globe. So maybe these kids also deserve to know about the one time that it really happened. Because we humans, we are the stories that we tell ourselves. We become the stories that we tell ourselves. They're self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think that especially right now, in an age of climate change, growing inequality, you name it, we need different stories.
It's a great point. Now, what's interesting about whether there's going to be enough drama in that movie, because they're getting along. It reminds me, you also write about a short-lived British television show called The People's Parliament, where they said, well, if we just put people in a room to discuss things, there'll be fireworks and people yelling at each other. And it turned out that wasn't what happened.
No, it wasn't good for ratings, because these people just had rational discussions and reached reasonable compromises. So that was terrible television.
It's terrible.
This happens every single time. I've got this one story in my book about the Stanford prison experiment. Many people will have heard about it. Philip Zimbardo, one of the most famous living psychologists still today. He put 24 students in a fake prison at the University of Stanford, 12 guards, 12 prisoners. And the standard story that everyone has heard is that these guards very quickly turned into savages, like Lord of the Flies type people. We now know that actually he specifically instructed these guards to behave as sadistic as possible, and that many of them said that he didn't want to do it. But then he said that he needed these results for the study so that he can go to the press and say, look, prisons are horrible environments. So the whole study was basically a hoax. It was later replicated for the BBC. This is the BBC prison experiment in 2002. 2 British psychologists who did the study, but they didn't instruct the guards to behave as sadistic as possible. They just gave them the freedom to do whatever they wanted to. And it was horrible television, absolutely horrible. I had to watch all the 4 episodes for my readers, for you, for everyone who's watching this. I'll never get those hours back. It's so boring. Nothing happens. Like already in the first episode, one of the guards says, can't we just be friends? And then in the last episode, they're all hanging together in the cantina, drinking tea, playing cards. It's a terrible indictment of human nature. This is what you get if you leave them alone. They're just going to create a pacifistic commune.
Yeah, well, thank you for your sacrifice for all of us in watching all of those. So it's an interesting. One of the other things I thought was interesting here. I'll make it a little bit personal. So I took the very first university psychology course I took was in the 1980s, and it's sort of a greatest hits album when you do an introductory psychology course, and we still had a lot of B.F. Skinner back in those days, but we moved on. And so we talked about the Stanford prison experiment. You say that's bogus, but we also talked about Stanley Milgram, and we also talked about Kitty Genovese. Tell us about those very classic pieces of psychological research that turn out to be less true than we thought, and whose conclusions are actually much more akin to your thesis.
Yeah, there are quite a few casualties in my book, I'm afraid. But so the Kitty Genovese story was really famous. At the beginning of the 60s in New York, Kitty Genovese was murdered by a man who supposedly, was able to stalk her and follow her in the middle of the night, while 37 people, according to the New York Times, had seen it happen and done nothing. I mean, not even called the police. And for many people, this was an example of urban apathy and another, indictment of human nature is that we're just alone in the big city. This anecdote or this story was later the basis for research into the so-called bystander effect, which says that when there's something happening, someone's drowning or attacked in the street, and a lot of people see it happening, and people don't help because they're like, it's not my responsibility. I'm going to grab a coffee or something like that. Someone else can do this. Turns out that actually this whole bystander effect doesn't exist, or actually it's pretty much the opposite. We based our conclusions in the first place on the fake news story of Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese actually died in the arms of her friends, we now know, and actually a couple of people did call the police, and those 37 bystanders didn't exist. They didn't
Right. I think you said there were 3 people who observed and 2 contacted the police.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the research into the bystander effect was mainly these laboratory experiments. And as you know, there's been a replication crisis in psychology. You know, we've got the publication bias where we only publish the studies that show positive results. Now we can't replicate many of these results. And there's a very fascinating new study that has just come in by Danish psychologist Marie Lindegaard, who didn't rely on these laboratory experiments, but on real evidence from real life. Because we've got cameras in cities these days everywhere.
Sure.
I'm not a great fan of that, but it's great for science sometimes because you can study how people actually behave when someone's drowning.
It's very those cameras are very Hobbesian.
Yeah, exactly. But then they do give us the evidence that in 90% of all cases, people help each other. And this is based on a big database that she built from incidents in Copenhagen, in South Africa, in London, and in Amsterdam. So it's very powerful evidence. So yeah, that's another one of those classics, bystander effect, that has really recently come crashing down. And actually, psychologists now believe there's a reverse bystander effect, where if more people see something happening, it's actually the chance goes up that someone will help because people find support in each other.
Interesting. Let's bring in one other iconic intellectual figure here who happens to be sitting on my desk, Charles Darwin. Okay, so you write about Darwin a lot, and obviously, if I have a stuffed doll on my desk, I'm a big Darwin fan. You have this fascinating phrase where you say people that human evolution is in part survival of the friendliest. Rather than survival of or in addition to at least survival of the fittest, or that friendliness is a form of fitness. Tell us about that.
Well, one of the great questions of evolutionary anthropology is, of course, why we survived. I mean, the Neanderthals have gone extinct. We're still here. Actually, we've conquered the globe. We built spaceships, pyramids, cathedrals. And then the question is obviously, what makes us so special?
Right.
And for a long time, we believed that, God had chosen us. Well, that's not exactly a scientific explanation. Then we started to believe that we're very smart, that we have these huge brains, and, other animals are stupid. We don't believe that anymore. I mean, you can do an intelligence test and let a human toddler of 2 years old compete with a pig, and often the pig wins. People will need to keep that in mind when they eat bacon, but that's another book. So the question is, what makes us so special? And the case that scientists are now making is that we're not very smart, we're not very strong, but we are very cooperative, we're very friendly. We have evolved to be friendly. So indeed, the term here is survival of the friendliest, which means that for millennia, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids, and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And you can really see this within our bodies. That's the fascinating thing. So if you compare skeletons from 50, 40, 30, 20, 10,000 years ago, you see the puppification of humanity. We have become Homo puppy. We literally look nicer than we look 50,000 years ago. This is called self-domestication. So exactly. You turn a wolf into a chihuahua, and that's basically the same process that has happened with us.
That I thought was absolutely a fascinating idea. Let me build on that just a little bit. When you talk about intelligence here for a second, because you have a lovely metaphor, I want you to use it here for the folks watching. You would argue that Neanderthals, if you think about Homo sapiens versus Neanderthals, that Neanderthals were actually smarter in one sense, and you have a great analogy to computing to help us understand that.
Yeah. So Neanderthals were a little bit like MacBook Pros, I'm arguing, but then we were more like MacBook Airs, but with Wi-Fi. So
the other one didn't have Wi-Fi, and that was it.
Yeah, and it's a big question. What is intelligence? What is knowledge? And if you think about it, you realize that it's actually a cumulative thing. It's a collective thing. Individually, people are not very smart. But then as we grow older, we get all these tools from our parents, from earlier generations, our language, for example. I mean, I'm speaking in English now. I didn't invent English on my own. English was an invention that took place over centuries, over millennia, for people to be able to speak. So that was basically a gift from our ancestors. And that's basically the same with every innovation, every technology that makes us so special. So indeed, that's so fascinating. If you compare humans and Neanderthals, actually Neanderthals have bigger brains than us.
Yeah, they have a faster chip, but we have Wi-Fi.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and if you just think about that truly, if you think about that in an individual term, would you rather have a fast computer without Wi-Fi or a slightly slower computer with Wi-Fi?
Yeah,
And it's not
yeah,
even close.
yeah.
It's because of those connections. One last question, Rutger. So we're in this midst, a really an extraordinary time in global society. What message in your work do you think there is for policymakers and even the rest of us trying to navigate today?
I think the central message would be something like cynicism is out and hope is in. If you just look at the huge generational differences we're seeing, you know, in the 1980s, it was avant-garde to be a cynic. It was avant-garde, you know, Reagan was massively popular in the US. Thatcher was most popular in the UK among young people. Now that's very different. There's a new generation coming. It's much more progressive, cares so much about stuff like climate change, and realizes that we need this massive transformation of the whole economy, and that no individual is going to be able to do that on his or her own, that we need to work together. We can only do that if we actually believe that we can do this, if we actually believe that human beings are deep down a cooperative species. So yeah, it's all about assuming the best in each other, because that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Let's leave it at that. Rutger Bregman, the book is Humankind, A Hopeful History, a book that I read a few months ago in galley form. I thought was amazing. I think it's even more relevant for today. Thanks so much for your thoughts, Rutger.
Thanks, Dan.